Blade of the Grass here. How does Part 6 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure connect to Part 7, Steel Ball Run? Out of universe, what connects each part in the series is this chain of lessons it teaches to the audience, which manifests in universe by having each JoJo face off against a worst-case scenario of the previous JoJo's threat. But in the story continuity, the timeline is left a bit ambiguous. Part 7's new universe could be in a completely separate continuity. Or if you take the animations trailer's word, it's after the original universe has completed a natural cycle and we've arrived at the next incarnation. Like in Futurama, where after the universe reaches its end, it repeats almost identically. But instead of specific characters being copied or reincarnating, it's more that the ideas behind everything, like fate itself, are what remain, being reimagined in different ways in a new combination. Which could work with the ending of Part 6, because Pucci describes the repeating of the universe as a cycle that does happen naturally, and we're never shown what the normal version looks like, only an artificial reset that displaces living beings from the old one out of time to carry them over so they have the exact same interpretations of fate as they did in the previous world. Because Made in Heaven hijacks the natural functions of the universe to create a world under Pucci's control in a process that takes a person's stand and eases it through feedback loops from existing mechanics within the wider universe to become symbolic of and stabilize agency over the rest of reality. It's possible that a natural rebirth of the universe that lets people of the old universe live out their actual lives doesn't carry those souls over or have them reincarnate at all. Because in the world of Part 7, we don't get one-to-one counterparts for the old characters. While some original universe characters do have counterparts, like Jonathan getting Johnny, other characters have their traits combined or spread across several. People's identities have overlap, and they don't follow the exact same family trees. So it's almost guaranteed that these characters are different people, and not the same souls that were in Parts 1 through 6. So if souls aren't normally carried over to new universes, Steel Ball Run could take place after Stone Ocean and not be a completely separate continuity. But the ending of Part 6 leaves the cycle of the universe in a state that's the opposite of what's needed to allow the plot of Steel Ball Run to work. The main way we do know Part 6 connects to Part 7 is how the stories relate to each other in general, across JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as a manga series. Normally, for convenience and to get publisher approval, stories are written with some kind of lesson they can represent. And if they're broken down into smaller arcs and conflicts, those can have their own layered lessons too. Especially when it's a manga, which have often been made with an emphasis on teaching readers how to outsmart problems and think in strategic or practical ways. But because every JoJo's adventure represents some abstract solution for a problem the audience might face, the next JoJo in the next part needs to be in some kind of situation where the previous JoJo solution doesn't work for them, whether it's because the new threat is stronger or because the character isn't lucky enough to have the same advantages and has to learn something that's new for the audience or helpful for whoever don't get to follow the previous story's advice because of what methods are accessible to them. As a result, the stakes often get higher, or the main JoJo has less agency than the previous one, and the story ends up being about how they're able to survive the outcome the previous JoJo fought to avoid. JoJo starts with a simple message of doing the right thing no matter how difficult it gets. The villain is a vampire who cuts corners with the power to take from others rather than embracing the harmony of nature. And the idea is that while wrong actions can be more effective in individual struggles, doing the right thing, supposedly, I wouldn't know, has the potential to harmonize with the world, where if everyone makes the right choices, there will end up being far less circumstances where people will have to struggle. So doing the right thing is more worthwhile to stay consistent with overall. And because this is an incentive for anyone in the universe to do the right thing, those who don't are at a disadvantage if called out and fought back against, like how the vampires are destroyed by concentrated energy from the sun. That's also why Dio, as a character, is the initial villain. If the message is do the right thing even when it's easier to do the wrong thing, the Joestars are role models, because even though they're born wealthy and powerful, which would tempt most people to exploit their advantages or live comfortably, each member of the family, George and Jonathan, consistently, of their own will, become compassionate and helpful people who do the right thing even when it's tough or unlikely to work out. Jonathan, as a socially outcast upper-class child who has his entire life ruined except for his status over commoners, chooses the harder path of attacking the actual hostile enemy responsible for making him miserable, rather than letting out his frustrations on the less fortunate. And even if he can't get rid of the problem, he comes out of it one of the kindest and most helpful people imaginable. And Dio is the opposite, because he's raised knowing the struggles people have to go through, but then tarnishes any opportunities he has for fortune or to help others out of his own sense of superiority. JoJo incorporates various cultures, arts, and religious themes, like how Buddhism is relevant to the idea of enlightenment in Stone Ocean. So because Dio is the Italian word for God, it's a way of saying how God, or the universe, might constantly challenge humanity, or the Joestars, through obstacles like Dio the character, and yet they remain on the side of justice. So Dio as a character and the Joestars as a family are both halves of that lesson of doing the right thing. In part 2, Joseph is of a generation that's lost his family status, and he has to deal with a stand-in for the highest status of people at the very top of society who eventually conquer the power of harmony over the universe, so not even sunlight is on his side. The Pillarmen are a species of ultimate beings at the top of the food chain, who treat the rest of the world as livestock and end up posing a threat because if any of them are born with even more individual advantages and ever go rogue, the rest of the world, and even their own kind, are then powerless to stop them. Joseph doesn't have Jonathan's status, like how he doesn't have Jonathan's superhuman amount of sunlight energy. And the beings he has to fight are what vampires replicate diluted forms of the powers of, like the difference between dead apostles and true ancestors in Tsukihime. So his only way of beating them is by making the idea of doing the right thing just a regular part of who he is, at his core, and completely masked on the surface. Because now, Joseph can apply it in all sorts of roundabout or convoluted ways, overwhelming his enemies and making sure he's never doing anything wrong, as he consciously focuses on scratching and clawing to get by. And that's why, in part 3, Jotaro then doesn't have to fight a physically stronger type of opponent. Instead, because these power systems work by symbolizing what exists in universe and then feeding that symbolism back onto what it's symbolizing to give it extra power or spiral, the idea that the Joestars are always going to be provided trials by Dio becomes a force of the universe, and now the fight is using and against the abstract powers of causality itself, like how after Tsukihime you get fate. It's not a guy that's physically scary, but a guy that's backed by reality, as it turns out that this whole time, tarot card divination has really been predicting this ultimate battle, and guaranteeing through Final Destination fate that this guy will be dangerous no matter what. Since his agency is boosted by this rule of reality, Dio is granted the power to progressively get stronger the longer things go on. And Jotaro's only hope is the idea that if you're not naturally given that kind of advantage of a guaranteed win by timeout, you can take whatever strength or agency you do have and stretch it as far as possible by being as careful, thoughtful, and controlled with it as you can, in the hope that it's enough. So Jotaro is given the power to concentrate his strength, to give him farther reach, or accelerate himself to stand a chance against the enemy's ability, up to an eventual 5-second limit. Because the challenge is for Jotaro to stretch his power against a guy who accumulates power to beat him before it's too late. In part 4, Josuke doesn't get the ability to control his power to amplify it. Instead, he's stuck with the opposite. His power comes from a berserk state where he loses control, so his power has to be something that counteracts it. Josuke has to learn to work around his emotional outbursts, so when he loses his temper, it's already in a directed or contained environment where he'll apply it transformatively to contribute to society. He's given a negative that he works into a positive, so instead of adding to his power, he reverses it. Crazy Diamond is Josuke's ability to make up for whatever he can, from whatever lines he hasn't crossed yet, so he can undo damage and restore stuff as long as it hasn't fully been wrecked or his destructive emotions get in the way. Because if he loses it, then even if he restores something, it will look different, because as a Joestar, he takes accountability and can't erase the past. But since Josuke does learn to apply his emotional drive transformatively, he learns to use this to fuse the building blocks of things together and make them stronger, instead of just reverting them. So then in part 5, Giorno doesn't get the power to restore things or strengthen them. Instead, he gets the power to create and protect new life, only able to heal someone if their injury is on a body part they can afford to replace. And also, unlike Josuke, who had the backing of society itself against a single villain, Giorno's stuck in a small team fighting a society, which has been taken over by a structure of organized criminal activity made to allow one dude to rule on top as an invincible tyrant. His enemy is an intangible force above the potential of individual humans. It's an empire, which means he could have no opportunities to actually beat it, and whether he does is out of his hands. So the point of Giorno's adventure is that he'd persevere anyway because you miss all of the shots you never take. And Giorno ends up being lucky enough to find some hidden gem outside of Diavolo's possession that could still triumph against all of Passion's advantages. And that brings us to Jolyne. In part 6, Jolyne doesn't have the hidden gem somewhere on her side that can still beat Pucci. Instead, she's having to scrape by when you don't get a miracle like that to solve your problems. Victory is entirely in Pucci's hands, and at that point, all you can do is go through hoops to try to get Pucci to mess up by himself. Like how Stone Free doesn't have the power to affect anything in the environment, just Jolyne's own body. Because the idea is that with no other options, you still have to hope, but stretch yourself as thin as possible to have the best chance of finding some weakness within your enemy themselves that you can take advantage of to keep them from acting on the power they now already have. Stone Ocean is about the child of Jotaro, the next Joestar. While Jotaro might have been able to put the Joestar's fated enemy, Dio, down for good, he didn't attack the force of fate itself. So Jolyne represents the butterfly effect. Dio's ambitions were able to spread through his worshippers, and now that it's Jolyne's turn to be the main JoJo, the forces against her have already been set in stone, and she's doomed from the start. She's the only JoJo born after all of that conflict against Dio happened, without any chance to have a say in it. Because Jotaro only beat the villain and not the idea of fate backing him, it only cemented Dio's eventual victory after death, since now when the universe makes his consequences a threat, there's no body to tie them to. Dio's ambitions can attack the Joestars like a curse, as the universe itself will transfer his agency of accumulating power to his followers, and box the Joestars into a scenario where there's now nothing they can do to survive. This is why Jolyne squeezing as much power out of herself as possible isn't enough to save the day like it was for Jotaro, since the wider forces of the universe are empowering Pucci with Dio's ability to elevate his power further, meaning that Jolyne will definitely eventually lose. Her stand power lets her make the most of whatever she still has, to see if she can find some way to slip past those obstacles slowly closing in and take her life into her own hands before she runs out of time, by giving her more flexible control over her body's structure. She can extend her range by spreading herself thin or tediously weave shapes together when they might fit the circumstance. But because her ability only affects her stand and her own body, her opportunities depend on getting something external to interact with from the wider universe in every conflict. Whereas the main villain is able to use the rules baked into the universe itself to naturally make himself stronger and rise to the top of the hierarchy of cause and effect. So in the long term, Jolyne is powerless against Pucci, and she'll be completely out of options by the time he gets the ability to speed through the life cycle of everything around her, destroying everything environmental she could ever work with. Until that happens though, Jolyne learns to use Stone Free more and more effectively, up to the point of even being able to make Mobius strips to counter an inside-out flipping power, and avoid falling when gravity is turned upside down. Even though she's doomed, she goes very far. And while she initially wants to use Stone Free to escape Green Dolphin, by the time she learns how to turn her own body into string, she realizes that fate is keeping her in a much worse prison no matter where she physically goes. So if fate is the ultimate weapon, and it's going to be used against her and hit her whether she's near it or does anything or not, it's more worthwhile to try to confront those enemies and look for any flaw within them that prevents them from making the most out of the weapon they're guaranteed to have. If there's any way to beat Pucci, it's not that you can keep him from having the power of the ultimate force in the universe and pulling the trigger or pulling it again whenever he wants. It's that maybe he's got a flaw within him where showing him the right circumstances will prevent him from thinking to use his advantages in the way that's invincible. So by the same principle of fate giving Dio extra power through Pucci, Jolyne can do the same for the Joestars by passing her will onto someone that's not of the bloodline. And out of all of the Part 6 crew, who share the trait of having their lives ruined and imprisoned by the harmful forces of fate, Emporio is a character born from Pucci's actions and forced into this endgame like Jolyne without being a Joestar. So Jolyne sacrifices herself, taking the binding of her bloodline with her, and granting Emporio the chance to capitalize on how Jolene's resistance has managed to get in Pucci's head and mess with him. The result of beating Pucci is that since his power had been hijacking the highest forces of cause and effect in the universe, creating a replica of the old universe while blocking out the souls of whoever didn't survive the process, and forcing everyone still living to go through their exact actions for the rest of their lives, the backlash from undoing Made in Heaven creates one more replica of the old universe, letting the blocked souls back in to reincarnate in happier lives, where they're not even bound by the forces of fate that let Pucci attain heaven in the first place, and Jolene is able to be born as her own person without having to be named a JoJo like those with the fate of the Joestars. Jolene and Emporio are able to stop the Heaven plan before it concludes, so they end up in a universe where Pucci and Dio aren't even able to achieve it, meaning the world is probably safe from it happening. But the idea behind the Heaven plan is that by having a follower be this conduit of the highest power over the universe and become your stand, you can reign over reality as a secret emperor. Because it's like you're a middleman hijacking the start of the chain of cause and effect. So everything ultimately revolves around your decisions and input whenever you make any. The Heaven plan was Dio's attempt to fit his name and become a god, creating an eternal force of heaven that could bind everyone else in the mortal world beneath it. The plan functioned by having him release his power, the embodiment of his agency, his stand, into the bodies of sinners to birth a son that could be a vessel for his will. And by fusing that son with a trusted friend, Dio could have that friend walk Via Dolorosa and bear his cross to become a force of power over humanity, spanning all of time and space, like the idea of timeless potential salvation from the crucifixion. Dio wants to make a false heaven, forcing the world to revolve around tangible manifestations of his will, rather than being something in the background that's truly letting the world run on its own. The ending of Stone Ocean is Jolene successfully preventing anyone from taking that seat behind causality, so nobody's agency is limited by a distinct sentient character's will. So Steel Ball Run is specifically in a world where someone has obtained that seat. There's a workforce of stand-like beings we're only shown glimpses of from the outside, but we know they all facilitate carrying out the will of something beyond the agency of and spanning the whole planet. And we know there was once a vessel for this power, whose corpse has been split into relics so strong all the planet's agency revolves around them, granting even unworthy people stands for as long as a relic is in their possession, and preventing someone from getting their natural stand that would represent them having the highest agency over anyone, the world. Because here, everything bends around hierarchies. Part 7 is specifically about a setting where people have to somehow struggle and succeed through the limit to agency that Emporio and Jolene fought to prevent ever coming into existence in Part 6. At least, that's the out-of-story intent behind it. So in-universe, there could be any number of explanations. Because while this makes a case for Stone Ocean and Steel Ball Run being separate continuities, since Stone Ocean left off preventing this system of heaven from existing, they could still be connected if the in-universe mechanic behind Part 7 is different from heaven and it just represents heaven out of story. Maybe it's just a different imagining of the ideas behind fate, or maybe somebody else just stuck their hand in the cycles of the universe sometime after Pucci and succeeded. But unless the mechanism becomes story relevant, and admittedly, mechanisms are pretty relevant in Part 9, what's important across the parts in JoJo is that the characters have to be lessons and their circumstances are progressively getting worse. And I'm very worried about what that says for Jodio.